Meet Jack Bennett, the evangelical mastermind behind the biggest charity fraud in American history. Over 6 years, Jack raised hundreds of millions of dollars from scores of Christian charities through his organization, embezzling about $135 million of that cash to live a life of luxury cars and fancy vacations. After having his cover blown by a lowly community college professor, Jack claimed that he had been motivated by a religious fervor caused by spirits reaching out to him from the heavens above. So how exactly did Jack build such a far-reaching network of fraud? What let him get away with his scheme for so long? And where did his utterly absurd excuses land him? John Grant Bennett Jr. was born in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania on July 31, 1937. He was the son of an alcoholic and a homemaker who struggled to make ends meet. Jack, as he liked to be called, was able to attend post-secondary schooling thanks to an interest-free loan of $3,500 provided to him by his church. This arrangement would influence his own interest in Christian charity later in life. Jack bounced around between jobs throughout his early adulthood, teaching science at the high school level before entering medical school at the relatively late age of 30. Jack's habit of spending hours in the library without so much as getting up to use the washroom earned him the nickname Old Iron Butt. After a year, though, Jack learned that his tenacity alone wouldn't be enough to pull him through his grueling coursework, and upon losing half his body weight due to stress, he finally dropped out to seek out a different path. Since his wife Joyce was expecting their first child, Jack had to find something quick to make sure there was food on the table. His doctor recommended he apply for a job as a drug coordinator for a local community outreach fighting the growing epidemic of heroin abuse in the Philadelphia area. Jack's own background dealing with his father's alcoholism, combined with the bedside manner skills he picked up in med school, made the job seem like an ideal fit. According to Christianity Today, Jack helped set up 7 drug treatment centers in Philadelphia over the course of 8 years. He was headhunted by Pennsylvania's governor to join the state's Council on Drug Abuse, a position that put him in the orbit of bigwig decision-makers across the state. Though rewarding, the job had terribly long hours that kept Jack away from his young family for days at a time. Jack resigned the position after only a few years, but by then he had managed to rub elbows with several highly influential persons throughout Pennsylvania. Jack's next move was setting up a company called Nova Institute International, whose services included working with charity organizations to help with fundraising. Rather than clients donating to their chosen charities who would then pay Nova Institute a commission, Jack believed his organization should act as a middleman and take their cut before the money even made it to the nonprofits. Unfortunately for Jack, this model didn't sit well with many of the organizations he was looking to work with. Though Jack boasted of his many connections to the rich and powerful, Nova Institute failed to raise the money he had hoped for. Jack tried rebranding the company as a consulting firm to up-and-coming charities looking to attract wealthy patrons. But this too was met with constant setbacks. Before long, the company was deep in the red, compounded by an angry IRS who wasn't getting their cut of the tax revenue. Eventually, Jack found himself personally on the hook for over $30,000 in back taxes, a considerable sum he just didn't have. He had also found himself in hot water with a local Christian charity he tried courting, who he had promised big fundraising opportunities to before coming up short 2 years later. According to Joseph T. Wells' book, Frankenstein's a Fraud, Jack had been handed a list of possible clients who he failed to follow up with even after 2 years. When one of the charity's organizers called him out on this, Jack insisted, quote, "I'm operating by faith here. If I've done anything to mislead you or hurt you, I'm sorry, but everything I've done here and said here was for the greater good." The excuse was hardly convincing, and Jack was accused of being a con artist. And this wouldn't be the last time in his life that he was called that. Nova Institute was all but decimated by the mid-1980s. Jack's wife persuaded him to turn to God for answers, and despite not having stepped in a church in over 15 years, he agreed to attend a service at the Church of the Savior. The congregation welcomed the family with open arms and helped them get back on their feet, raising funds to pay off that hefty tax bill that loomed over their head. Even more important than that, though, were the people Jack met through the church, who included some of the upper echelons of Philadelphia's political and spiritual apparatus. Through them, Jack could make moves towards rebuilding his professional career, starting with a new organization he'd dub Human Services Systems. In setting up HSS, Jack was aided by several prominent names from the state of Pennsylvania, including the CEO of a local insurance company and a well-known Philadelphia city councilman. The for-profit business's mandate was to provide mental health services to the employees of its various clients, including big names such as Playtex, Bell Telephone, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. His contract with Bell was especially lucrative, giving him the opportunity to sit on the boards of several prominent organizations throughout the state. This, of course, helped make Jack Bennett a household name in philanthropy circles across the Atlantic seaboard. As HSS continued to expand, Jack created a non-profit organization he dubbed the Center for New Era Philanthropy, which performed a similar role as Nova Institute by helping allocate funds for Christian charities. The beginnings for New Era were, much like its predecessor, fairly unsuccessful. HSS had been facing the same issues that plagued Nova Institute, with invoices going unpaid and payroll checks bouncing left and right. Employees were surprisingly forgiving of Jack due to their belief that these challenges were part of God's plan, and remained confident that Jack would eventually come through. But behind the scenes, Jack began shifting money between HSS and New Era while skimming some of the cash for himself, an illegal practice known as check kiting. By 1987, Jack's scheme was sniffed out by HSS's financial officer John Salveson. John had been on his case about the constant back and forth between New Era and HSS, saying it had led to a domino effect where checks weren't clearing. Jack relented. He didn't know how New Era could cover the funds HSS needed to pay its bills, and that he had written the checks under the belief that God would somehow provide. John scoffed that things didn't work that way in the real world, and although Jack knew this in his heart, he later told reporters he went ahead anyways to fulfill his God-given mission of changing the world. Jack's mother died of a sudden heart attack in 1989. The businessman disappeared for 3 weeks before returning to HSS to give his employees a rousing speech about how she inspired him to dedicate his life to helping others. The speech moved his staff enough to maintain confidence in their increasingly manipulative boss. Jack found himself clashing with John Salveson yet again a short time later. After running some numbers, the financial officer realized that some $300,000 that was supposed to go towards Bell had found its way into Jack's personal bank account. Jack insisted that this was his compensation for consultation and fundraising efforts, but John pressed him on this, saying he would have needed to work over 300 days in a year solely on the Bell account to justify such a high payout. Jack brushed him off by saying he'd bring in his logbook of billable hours the following week, which placated John for the time being. But that Monday, John came in to see the locks being changed on the filing cabinets at HSS, causing him to quit in disgust shortly thereafter. An undeterred Jack introduced the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy in late 1989, a successor to his earlier nonprofits. He had recently become friends with the chief physician at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, one Dr. John Templeton Jr. Dr. Templeton's father was a renowned investment banker known for his philanthropy, who quickly took Jack under his wing, offering him a role teaching Bible-based fundraising techniques at the Templeton Institute. But despite his recent success, Jack continued to struggle with managing the money raised by his organizations. Frankenstein's a Fraud recounts that Jack was well known around the office for his confusing one-liners like, "This amount will triple by 40%, and there are only 3 months left in the quarter." He had continued his practice of check kiting throughout 1989, racking up deficits of almost $1 million across his various bank accounts. He would need a plan to cover those losses before anyone caught on to what was happening, coming up with a bold new scheme that would ultimately be his undoing. By 1990, Jack had impressed John Templeton Sr. so much that he was made a director for every major fund bearing the family's good name. He had become a familiar face amongst the Philadelphia elite, appearing at prayer breakfasts and taking on leadership roles in charities across the city. Christianity Today wrote that Jack had leveraged the credibility of the Templeton Institute to insinuate that his Foundation for New Era Philanthropy was guided by the same moral tenets that he had been teaching at the organization. But trouble was already brewing at New Era. A manager at Philadelphia National Bank noticed suspicious activity going on between New Era's multiple bank accounts, electing to freeze them as they tried getting to the bottom of this. Jack had to act fast to avoid being outed as a fraudster. He approached Dr. Templeton with an interesting proposition. He had been in contact with an anonymous, high-standing member of the local community interested in bankrolling a new type of charity, where donors would contribute a minimum of $5,000 to be held by New Era for 3 months, then matched dollar for dollar and released to their preferred organization. In essence, this would double the value of each donation. Jack told Dr. Templeton that he had been tasked with finding 20 willing participants to get the project off the ground. It all sounded too good to be true, because, as you will soon find out, it was. Jack was able to collect his first 20 donors to get the project up and running. Pamphlets for New Era waved away the unorthodox donation method as, quote, "the way the anonymous donors want it," insisting that the interest accrued on the held funds would be used to cover the organization's overhead expenses. Jack also assured his donors that this 3-month waiting period allowed New Era to vet the charities it was handing the money off to as a means of ensuring their legitimacy. The foundation for New Era Philanthropy's donation matching program was a resounding success. As New Era's unique system caught on, several big names eager to have their money doubled wanted in on it. Such individuals included a former Treasury Secretary from the Nixon administration and a grandson of J.D. Rockefeller. Jack was able to use the funds he had collected to start paying off his many outstanding bank balances, with $20,000 going to the Philadelphia National Bank as a sign of good faith to get his account unfrozen. Jack had also received a $250,000 payment from Bell Atlantic for consultation services, which he'd used to pay off his earliest backers in early 1990. This would be the first and only time that donations would be matched with clean money. There was, of course, a glaring drawback to Jack's plan. In order to keep things running, he would have to continue to court bigger donations from a wider pool of donors. Minimum contribution amounts would need to be raised, and the time before payouts delayed. A well-connected friend of Jack's named Doug Holliday helped persuade his contacts at Goldman Sachs to bankroll New Era. Doug brought Jack along with him to prestigious prayer breakfasts at Manhattan's Lynx Club, where he mingled with the extremely wealthy. By now, Jack was telling potential donors that his circle of anonymous contributors had expanded to 7. Because of course they didn't exist, he remained extremely elusive about their possible identities, going so far as to tell people he kept their list of names hidden in a safety deposit box. In time, the number of individual participants looking to have their donations doubled swelled to over 100. Jack told his donors that his anonymous contributors were so impressed by the program's success that they had decided to expand it, promising to match donations of $50,000 or more. To make this work, he told participants he'd need to lengthen the waiting time of payouts to 6 months and beyond. Word about New Era spread like wildfire, and before long, Christian institutions like John Brown University and Wheaton College were on board. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were soon flowing into New Era's coffers, with no end in sight. Behind the scenes, Jack was using the much larger recent donations to fund the matching of older contributions. He continued extending the waiting period for the release of funds from 6 months to 10 months, which no one questioned as New Era had already proven itself legitimate. Contributions increased exponentially from year to year, going from over $360,000 in 1990 to over $41 million by 1993, with the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences alone giving $250,000 in funding. This handsome donation caught the attention of other major institutions throughout Philadelphia, who all followed suit. Jack was enjoying a more lavish lifestyle than he ever knew, wearing name-brand clothing and driving fancy cars as he continued mingling with the rich and powerful. New Era moved into an impressive office space decorated with pictures of Jack standing side by side with the likes of Ronald Reagan, Billy Graham, and Richard Nixon. To continue motivating his staff, Jack had the idea to pay out commissions of 10% on all monies raised. This attracted a gaggle of sales representatives eager to earn a paycheck off the money-doubling donation system. Jack began recommending that organizations donate to themselves, netting an easy double-up thanks to how New Era operated. The obvious questions about why the anonymous donors would go along with this went ignored, owing to the reputation New Era had built for itself through scores of happy charities benefiting from its unusual tactics. Not wanting to bite the hand feeding them, these organizations generally discouraged their employees from digging too deeply into how Jack Bennett's foundation operated. New Era had one other advantage that helped keep the scheme running so long. Until 1993, it had relied almost entirely on word of mouth for growth, allowing it to fly under the radar for the most part. That same year, though, New Era became the target of scrutiny from an unexpected source, an accounting professor at one of the colleges benefiting from New Era's schemes, who did bookkeeping for the school on the side. For the time being, no one took the professor's skepticism seriously, but within a few months, the concerns he was raising became impossible to ignore. Frankenstein's a Fraud tells us that New Era couldn't technically be called a foundation for one simple reason. There was no endowment funding its charitable contributions. Whenever questioned on where the money was going, Jack would simply state that he was too busy with the fundraising side of the business to know exactly what was being spent. Much of the money was handled by a prudential financial branch in Kenosha, with Jack telling donors that their money was held in escrow or quasi-escrow accounts that funded low-risk investments which always guaranteed a return. Except such escrow accounts didn't actually exist. In truth, Jack had total and immediate access to all donated funds at all times. At one point, an administrative assistant from Prudential called Jack to inform him that a client had inquired about the details of their escrow account. Jack was furious that she had said too much, warning her to never repeat this mistake or he'd have her fired. The admin assistant was advised she could only disclose to clients what type of investment vehicle their money was parked in, when their contribution would mature, and the names on New Era's board of directors. Though Jack had provided her a list of names, the foundation didn't even have a board of directors. Jack used this same list of phony board members in applying for tax-exempt status with the IRS. He had also somehow managed to keep the money doubling program a complete secret from auditors poking around their books in 1994. Instead, Jack told them that New Era was doing so well that it had almost zero in liabilities. But the IRS offered pushback. They questioned why New Era hadn't been filing income reports, along with how it could be listed as a foundation when it had no endowment to back it up. Jack bought time by saying both issues were oversights on the part of his accountants, and that he'd see to it that the matters were resolved as soon as possible. This excuse won him an extension on his 1994 filing. With the heat from the IRS temporarily taken off New Era, Jack continued building it up dramatically despite the increasing difficulty in making the foundation appear legitimate. Christianity Today reported that Jack was showing a waning interest in attending church services or prayer breakfasts, instead setting his sights on more secular organizations. He was still doing business with scores of Christian charities and institutions, but began ingratiating himself with a number of for-profit organizations to maintain the Ponzi scheme New Era was operating. 1994 was New Era's most successful year to date, seeing an increase of almost quadruple the amount of cash of the previous year. Behind the scenes, though, Jack was essentially playing a game of whack-a-mole. He had infused his older company, Human Services Systems, with several $1 million to keep it from going bankrupt, which could threaten to blow the lid off his whole scheme. Nevertheless, he continued skimming cash for himself, taking enough dough that he could afford to put both his children in brand new homes and pay off his son-in-law's student debt. Jack also began globetrotting with his wife Joyce under the guise of offering consultation to charity groups worldwide, in one instance flying to Hong Kong to give a talk to Chinese philanthropists on ethics in business and charity. But little did he know there was trouble facing him on the horizon. Flashback to 1993. An accounting professor named Albert Meyer at Spring Arbor University was doing bookkeeping for the school when he noticed something fishy going on with one of the donations listed in their financial records. Spring Arbor had donated over $294,000 to an organization called Heritage of Values Foundation, Inc. Heritage of Values was a subsidiary of another organization, none other than the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy, which had promised to double the donation within a few months. Rather than quell his curiosity, Albert only grew more suspicious about the program. He first raised the issue with his boss, who explained to him, quote, "We apply for the grant. Bennett invests the money in safe government bonds, and the return pays his overhead." This answer didn't leave Albert satisfied. He knew that the payouts on safe government bonds with quick turnarounds were too low to cover the operating costs of New Era like he was told, which ought to number in the millions. Furthermore, he was troubled by the fact that the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy was not formally registered as a foundation owing to its lack of an endowment.
We got donations of $300,000 and we sent it to New Era with a promise that we'll get $600 back. Now to me, that was, within 6 months you double your money. And to me, it was just Ponzi scheme right from the beginning.
He took the matter to the school's board of directors, but his concerns were dismissed as, quote, alarmism. Nevertheless, Albert pressed on and obtained New Era's financial statements for 1993, which appeared to have been altered as there were no liabilities listed. Albert knew there should have been millions. When he tried contacting the organization for clarification, he found them resistant to giving straight answers, and was all but warned to back off. Albert recalls the day Spring Arbor received its doubled-up contribution from New Era.
And they got the money back and they called me in and waved the check and said, "You see it all?" I said, "They are going to ask you for $1 million now, because they need the 600 back, because that's what you do." And they said, "Oh, well, I'm silly and I'm going to stick to what I do in the classroom."
Despite the mockery, Albert plowed ahead through 1994. Once again, he warned the school's trustees that something was amiss, but was brushed off. Spring Arbor continued funneling money to New Era to have it matched, as Albert continued trying to find someone who'd take him seriously. Shortly after receiving tenure at Spring Arbor, Albert decided it was time to go all in. By 1995, New Era had extended its presence across the globe, with satellite offices in London and British Hong Kong. Albert had reached out to journalists at the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Wall Street Journal, along with the FBI, SEC, IRS, and American Institute for Certified Public Accountants. As the SEC began looking into the situation, they got in touch with Prudential, who conducted their own inquiry into the New Era account. They discovered that the foundation had recently taken out a loan of $52 million on margin, money that was ostensibly being used to cover some of the payouts in the money doubling program. This concerned Prudential, who went ahead and called in the loan. Though Jack was able to come up with $7.1 million, he refused to provide certain documentation requested by Prudential. Consequently, he was given 24 hours to pay back the sum $44.9 million he still owed or face a lawsuit. The deadline came and went, and Jack failed to meet the ultimatum to keep himself out of court. By now, a reporter named Steve Stecklow from the Wall Street Journal had been convinced by Albert Meyer to do some digging into the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy, prompting him to write a series of 3 front-page stories published throughout May 1995, with more to follow as the story developed. Meanwhile, Prudential went ahead with their lawsuit against New Era on May 12th. Steve Stecklow's article mentioned that rumors were spreading that the group of wealthy supporters backing New Era did not actually exist. When reached for comment, Jack refused to divulge their identities, citing confidentiality. Jack also refused to comment on his organization's finances. Since the account containing the donor money was used as collateral towards the Prudential loan, there was a serious risk of this money vaporizing, which would jeopardize the dozens of nonprofits who had grown accustomed to the easy money New Era made for them. The Wall Street Journal article went on to say that John Templeton Sr. was not in fact one of the anonymous contributors who helped match funds, as had often been assumed since New Era was first established. Steve Stecklow obtained a receipt from one of the countless entities that had entrusted their money to New Era, wherein the received funds were curiously labeled as a gift. Not only that, several other discrepancies were discovered in the organization's financial records. For instance, Dr. John Templeton Jr. was one of 4 listed members of the board of directors who had never actually served in that role for New Era. Jack covered for this by saying their accounting firm had mixed up the names of actual board members with people who had previously been considered for the role, and that the foundation had simply never gotten around to correcting the mistake. As well, New Era's 1993 tax returns reported that a measly sum of just over $33,000 was all of the revenue made off of the $41 million contributed to the foundation that year, a figure that would hardly cover the overhead costs Jack claimed the interest was used for. He deflected further questions by saying 1993 was a year of restructuring, rather than one driven by profit. More shocking was the report that New Era had only eaten about $31,000 in liabilities that year, despite taking and returning millions in donations in that time. Other discrepancies, like the mislabeling of a financial review as an audit, were given equally flimsy explanations. In this instance, the error was blamed on an unnamed low-level employee at New Era's accounting firm who, conveniently, was no longer with the company. But these excuses weren't enough to combat the scrutiny New Era was now facing from all sides. The Philadelphia Inquirer reported that the Foundation for New Era Philanthropy filed for bankruptcy in the wake of the Prudential lawsuit, reporting liabilities as high as $550 million against just $60 million in assets. Jack was beside himself, becoming lost in the darkest of thoughts after seeing no way out of the situation. While driving down the I-95, he had almost taken his car into the Delaware River, stopping at the last moment when he accidentally dialed his car phone and thought the voice on the other end was God. It turned out to be one of Jack's friends, and this moment of realization pulled Jack out of his darkness long enough to avoid catastrophe. It was clear the jig was up. Jack called his staff into the office to confess that he had abused their trust, telling them, quote, "I've betrayed you all. I'm so ashamed of myself. All I ever wanted to do was help people. There are no anonymous donors." This chilling revelation sent shockwaves through the entire New Era organization. Jack went on to videotape a confessional to his some 500 former clients and other associates, in which he compared his vision for changing the world to that of Martin Luther King Jr. and apologized for the mess New Era had caused. Surprisingly, though, Jack didn't give away the entire plot, also apologizing to the anonymous philanthropists who, as we know, didn't exist. Even after confessing to his own staff, Jack still felt it necessary to keep the lie going to the general public. A full-blown government investigation was launched at both state and federal levels, making New Era's demise all but inevitable. Albert Meyer felt vindicated after Spring Arbor's president personally called him to tell him, quote, "You were right all along. We should have listened to you." Though many charities were able to narrowly avoid financial ruin after reading the earliest bombshell reports, countless others were not so lucky. It's believed that New Era had dozens of clients left on the hook after its collapse and liquidation, with one pastor losing as much as $27.5 million from the fallout. The Washington Post reported that some charities had even taken out loans to donate to New Era, but instead of enjoying easy money, they were straddled with crippling debt. And it wasn't strictly Christian colleges caught up in the scam. Secular institutions like the American Red Cross and the Franklin Institute had also parked their money with New Era in hopes of seeing it double, but lost out.
In what's being called one of the biggest financial scams, millions are lost, many affected. As the New Era fundraising organization is under investigation, meet the people hurt by this scandal.
I'm Larry King. Join me for the Bulletin, Friday at 8 on KYW3.
The story quickly blew up in the media. Outsiders with a background in finance were amazed at the number of people who fell for the con, with one state security commissioner reasoning that pure gullibility was what allowed the scheme to thrive. Another state official was less charitable, telling the Washington Post, quote, "They're obviously not smart and sophisticated at all, or they wouldn't have fallen for such an obvious scam." Yet one college professor whose school was affected by the scandal defended the victims, saying that the high volume of rich and powerful individuals associated with New Era gave it credibility. Indeed, the impact of names like Rockefeller and Templeton lending New Era an aura of legitimacy couldn't be understated. The New York Times reported that the court-appointed trustee for New Era had asked for beneficiaries of the organization to return any profits made so restitution could be given to those who lost out. By now, the fact that there were no anonymous donors had become public knowledge. It was reported that Jack had funneled $1.4 million from New Era to his consulting firm, Bennett Group International, with $350,000 in consulting fees paid out to two of his employees. The SEC claimed that a total of $4.2 million had been shifted from New Era to other companies Jack had owned. The Morning Call speculated that evangelical Christians were a perfect mark for Jack because of their inclination to go along with trends that proved personally popular within their social circles. David Winter of Westmont College believed that evangelicals were blinded by Jack's apparent piousness, speculating, quote, "If Bennett had not been a Christian person, they would have asked the tough questions. Because he was involved, they felt uncomfortable asking the tough questions." Going further, David also believed that wishful thinking further legitimized the fraud. Quote, "My other theory is our heritage is to believe in miracles." He added that despite Jack promising something that sounded too good to be true, quote, "For Christians, that's what a miracle is." In the end, only 5 of the 28 colleges who had donated to New Era expecting to double their money had posted gains from the organization. Despite calls from the court-appointed trustee for charities to return any profits gained from the New Era fraud, Christianity Today wrote that by April 1996, most of these organizations were either unable or unwilling to do so. In some cases, these organizations waited to see if other organizations would return the money before going ahead and doing it themselves. Some had already earmarked money received from New Era for programs or investments they were now unable to back out of. To help encourage the returning of monies, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability created guidelines for how funds could be fairly redistributed to those who lost out. The ECFA's president reminded its members that giving back ill-gotten gains was, quote, "biblically and morally correct." The court-appointed trustee continued holding out hope that these Christian organizations would act in good faith, but warned that a lawsuit to claw back the money was not off the table if they failed to do so. As for Jack Bennett, he was facing charges of fraud which he vehemently denied. He refused all requests for comment by the media. Jack voluntarily surrendered his millions of dollars worth of assets along with his $620,000 family home as part of his deal with the court, citing a desire to make things right. Cynical onlookers believed he only did so to avoid another lawsuit. By September, a majority of the organizations that had profiteered off New Era's Ponzi scheme had in fact returned the money. Amazingly, rather than outrage, there was a general sense of disappointment in Jack by both his staff and the nonprofits he had duped. Grief counselors were made available to employees who were emotionally compromised by their boss's betrayal. John Templeton Sr. stood by Jack even in the midst of this, telling the Wall Street Journal, quote, "I think he will have good answers, and as people get to know him, I think people will have the same view of him that I do." Others fooled by Jack noted that his homespun appearance helped sell his credibility, adding that he was never one to waver on money. On September 27th, Jack was charged with 82 counts of fraud, among them accusations of money laundering and filing false tax returns. If found guilty, he could face over 900 years in prison and up to $28 million in fines. Jack pled innocent to these charges and was released on bail after putting up his daughter's home as collateral. He was placed in psychiatric care as his attorney began mounting an insanity plea as his defense. Jack told the court that he had visions owing to brain damage he suffered from a car crash in 1984. The New York Times wrote that he was trying to blame, quote, phantom voices that he said had given him bad financial advice. Though he insisted that he had never intended to defraud anyone since starting New Era in 1989, the courts believed this was a deliberate Ponzi scheme from the beginning. By March 1997, Jack was in and out of court insisting on his own innocence by saying he had been gripped by a, quote, uncontrollable religious fervor, and that he had heard voices tell him that New Era was part of a divine plan to change the world. Jack's lawyer added that he had at one point set up a special savings account on God's behalf. Jack also related that he genuinely thought he had been hosting meetings and conference calls with the imagined donors. Jack apparently used to go to the New Era office conference room on Sunday afternoons, and after putting down paper and pencils at each seat, the donors would appear as if by magic. Another version of the story he told had the donors appear before Jack after he touched the room's doorknob. Despite these wild claims, the court did not agree with Jack's insanity defense, in part because his legal team had tried simultaneously characterizing him as both sane and insane. His lawyer nevertheless kept up the religious fervor argument, saying that as a result his client would not be fit to stand trial. Jack was tested by a handful of psychiatrists, with the prosecution concluding that he had faked both brain damage and mental illness. 2 weeks before the trial was set to begin, Jack pled no contest to his federal fraud charges. Jack's sentencing hearing took place in September 1997. He told the judge that he had never been good with handling money and keeping proper financial records, in what the Wall Street Journal called a rambling testimony. He insisted he had a hard time saying no to those in need, and didn't feel there was a problem with writing checks for money he didn't have if he was confident he could get it. These excuses apparently worked on some of his victims, who petitioned the court to be lenient on Jack. One even believed that Jack should return to working for non-profit organizations after a short stint in prison. The prosecution wasn't convinced, though, arguing that the court ought to make an example out of Jack under the fullest extent of the law. Ultimately, Jack was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with no chance for parole. Jack accepted blame for this, but in his statement insisted he had been delusional and had meant no harm. He tried explaining his need to change the world had gotten away from him, telling the court, quote, as the years passed by, the desire became a dream, the dream became a need became an obsession, the obsession became a fantasy, and the fantasy became a delusion. The FBI called the New Era ordeal the single largest financial fraud involving an American charity in history, far beyond that of Jim Bakker's PTL Club scandal in the 1980s. It would remain the biggest Ponzi scheme in America up until the discovery of Bernie Madoff's crimes in the mid-2000s. Following his sentencing, Jack tried filing for an appeal, but this was denied. There was no getting out of it. He would be spending more than a decade behind bars. By 2005, Jack was angling for an early release from prison on the basis of good behavior. Some of his past victims had forgiven him, even writing to President Bush to have him pardoned. Jack would nevertheless wait 2 more years to be transferred to a halfway house before his full release in March 2008. Though Warren Smith tried interviewing him for his book Faith-Based Fraud, Jack refused, saying he was writing his own memoirs about what happened over at New Era. Jack died in summer 2024 without ever publishing that book. The New Era Philanthropy scandal now serves as a testament to the willingness of individuals to ignore very obvious red flags as long as they're getting a piece of the action, until the day that they learn a costly and harsh lesson. Charity or not, there really is no such thing as a free lunch.